Hi, this is Keaton Kira. I'm a soon-to-be international master living in Dallas, Texas, and we're going to be talking about the dragon today. So white starts off e4. Black plays the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, d6, d4, standard open Sicilian. Black takes on d4. Knight takes d4, knight f6. Knight c3, and of course from this position, black has many Sicilians to choose from, and g6, black goes into the dragon. So in this case, white's most dangerous way to respond to the dragon is the Yugoslav attack. The Yugoslav attack is the only opening that I believe is any real threat to the dragon. So for the Yugoslav attack, white starts out bishop e3, and white's idea is to use this bishop to neutralize black's powerful dragon bishop, which will be fianchettoed on g7, breathing fire down the long diagonal. So bishop e3, and black plays bishop g7. It's a common idea here for black to want to trade off this knight for white's dark squared bishop, which would allow black's dragon bishop to have free reign. But there's a problem with playing this move, knight g4, immediately. If you'd like, you can pause the tape here and try to find the problem. This move, knight g4, is losing for black after white's response, bishop b5 check, and black has no good way of dealing with this check. If bishop d7, then simply queen takes g4, wins a piece. So black isn't ready yet for knight g4. He goes bishop g7, and now white plays f3, which keeps black's knight out of g4 and prepares for him to later play g4 himself, which is a common idea when white's castled on the queen side. And now if white decides not to play f3 and plays queen d2, continuing to prepare to castle queen side, now this knight g4 works for black because there's no white queen aiming at the knight. So here knight g4 is a good idea for black. So white plays f3. The next two moves for black are interchangeable. He can castle or play knight c6, but those should always be his next two moves. Say castles, for example, white plays queen d2, preparing the castle queen side, and knight c6. And here white has three main options. For the most part, two main options. He can play bishop c4, or he can castle queen side now. And these moves are very different, and we'll look thoroughly at both of them. And today I plan to focus on this move 9, bishop c4. The other move, which is a very rare move, is g4 in this position, but we won't get into that just yet. So let's try to understand the difference between these two moves, castling queenside and bishop c4. So if white castles queenside, he doesn't have this bishop on c4, which is covering d5 and e6, and that gives black some added options. Here he can play knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and bishop e6, and develop this bishop to a good square where it's putting pressure on white's queenside. Or black can go for the central break d5, which breaks open the center and gives black good chances to equalize and have a comfortable position. However, if white plays bishop c4, these options are no longer possible because of the bishop's control on this diagonal. So here black has to settle for bishop d7. And here, as we're going to see in a game today, one of the main plans for black is to go rook c8 and then play, after white's bishop has to move, which we'll see, black's going to go knight e5 and knight c4 and trade off his knight for that bishop. Now, one thing that I want to mention let's say that white castles queenside on move 9, instead of playing bishop c4. Here it would be a very bad idea for black to go for that same plan of bishop d7, rook c8, and transferring his knight to c4, because now white's bishop is going to take that knight from its starting square, having never moved, whereas in the other variation, which we'll see today, that bishop moves twice. It moves to c4 and then to b3. So this basically saves white 2 tempos, and in the dragon, which is such a sharp opening where both sides are castled the opposite way and attacking the opposing king, certainly losing 2 tempos would be a disaster. That means that you're going to lose the game. So let's look here at bishop c4. And here black continues bishop d7. And now white castles queenside, preparing to do a pawn storm on the king side. There's a few moves for black here. It's possible to play rook c8, a very natural move, putting the rook on the c file and x-raying the bishop. There's a move here, rook b8, known as the Chinese dragon. Rook b8 looks a little bit strange, but the idea is that black is going to advance b5, and this rook will be useful on the b file. And there's a common move, queen a5 here, which is a very common attacking move in the dragon. Queen a5, it's possible to play here. Today we're going to talk about rook c8. So rook c8, which was the first line of the dragon that I ever learned. I always played this line as a kid. The rook is x-raying that bishop on c4, and white has to do something about it. If he were to continue with h4, now black has a winning tactical shot. Knight takes d4. White has to recapture with his queen to protect the bishop, and now after knight g4, with his triple attack on the queen and both bishops, white's losing material. So h4 is not possible. White goes bishop b3, keeping his bishop on this strong diagonal, and black plays knight e5. And notice how this rook is bearing down on the c file. It has a lot of scope, and it's putting pressure against white's king. And very often in this position, black will sometimes sacrifice an exchange on c3. He'll sacrifice the rook for that knight in order to open up white's king. It's a very common idea in the dragon. So this bishop on g7 looks a little bit covered up right now, but we'll see how that changes as the position unfolds. So after knight e5, white should play h4 and begin his attack. And now black has an option here to play h5 and stop white's attack. It's a very sharp line. Personally, I don't like it for black. I think it goes against a lot of the principles of the dragon, which are don't move the pawns around your own king, instead focus on attacking the other person's king. So I don't really like h5, but it is a legitimate line. Knight c4, though, is more common. Bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, and now we're going to be following a game that Karpov played against Kortschnoi shortly before Karpov became the world champion. And here in this game, Karpov played h5, sacrificing the h-pawn in order to open the file for his rook. Knight takes h5 and g4. Knight back to f6, and now white needs to think about how he wants to continue his attack. It's very tempting to play this move bishop h6 now, and this is indeed a fine move, but there's an unnecessary complication with bishop h6, and that is that allows black the tactical resource knight takes e4, attacking the queen and with the double attack on this knight on d4. And knight takes e4 is a very sharp line. White has several options here. The best is considered queen e3, actually. Let's look for a minute. Let's say that if he plays knight takes e4, rook takes d4, and queen h2, and here black trades on d1, And white should take with his king because he needs this rook on the h file for his attack. So white takes with his king. And it looks like white's attack is very strong, but here black has some options where he can sacrifice an exchange and have an okay position. For example, he can even play something like bishop takes b2, and after bishop takes f8, king takes f8, queen takes h7, it looks like white's attack is really good, but it's actually not so amazing because a common theme in the dragon, when this bishop controls these squares, there's no way for white to get a checkmate here because the bishop controls all the squares where the queen would like to go. So black is actually okay here. So let's look at the more common move after knight takes e4, queen e3. And here black sacrifices the exchange like we talked about. White's forced to take with the pawn and have his king opened up. And now black retreats, knight f6. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7, the standard queen h6 check. King h8 is a very important move, king h8, because black needs this resource, rook g8, rook g7, sometimes to be able to defend this pawn. And here black is fine. This position is considered equal. This knight on f6 holds the pawn on h7 very nicely, so there's no mate threat. And if you try to dislodge the knight with g5, it's a typical dragon theme, knight h5, ruining the coordination between the queen and the rook. And here, for example, if white sacrifices the exchange back in order to open the h file, takes, and queen takes, here black needs that idea, rook g8, and after rook h1, he's just in time with rook g7, defending that h7 pawn. So Karpov was a very safe player. He didn't like to take unnecessary risks. And so instead of playing bishop h6, he played this move knight on d to e2, which will prevent this knight e4 idea. And it also keeps an eye on this other knight because, as we said, a lot of times black will be looking to sacrifice an exchange on c3, and that knight on e2 watches that knight on e3 nicely here. So what else is there for black to do except continue with his attack? Queen a5. White played bishop h6, and they traded, and rook c8. So this is a very important position. Both sides have the attacking setup that they want. Black has his rooks barreling down toward the king on the c file with the queen out on a5 to help, and white has his queen and rook lined up on the h file. That h7 pawn is being held by a thread, right, with this knight on f6. And here, Karpov played a strong prophylactic move, rook d3, which further prevents any of black's nonsense with taking the knight on c3, which can be a common idea here. Let's take a look and see if white plays more aggressive with this move g5. After g5, of course, black is forced to play knight h5, like we talked about. And now let's say that white's knight comes into f4, trying to distract that knight. Of course, it can't be taken because queen h7 and queen h8, it's mate in 2. So knight f4. Here, black has a very common counter-attacking idea. Rook takes c3. And after pawn takes c3, queen takes c3, threatening mate and preparing queen a1, black's position became very good. And after rook takes c3, if knight takes h5, here after rook takes c2, king b1, rook takes b2, black at least has a draw by perpetual with queen c3 and queen c2 check, and black might even have an opportunity to play for more. So this idea for white to play knight f4 doesn't work yet. So that's why Karpov, he played here rook d3, further supporting this knight and preparing to play g5 and then knight into f4 or g3. So in this moment, there wasn't so much theory known about this position, and Kortschnoi made a mistake here. He played rook on 4 to c5. So let's look at how this game finished. Karpov won this game brilliantly for white, and then we'll go back to this position and look at how black should have played, because this position is actually fine for black. So in the game, Kortschnoi made this mistake, rook back to c5, but the idea is to prevent white from playing g5. But you see in chess, it's always annoying when you play a move to prevent a certain idea, and then your opponent plays it anyway. And here, Karpov played g5 with the attack on the knight. So Kortschnoi played rook takes g5, and now Karpov played rook d5, a powerful move, intercepting the queen and the rook. And of course, this knight can't take because that knight is pinned down to this checkmate in 2. So after rook d5, Kortschnoi was forced to play rook takes d5, and Karpov recaptured with his knight, putting pressure on the knight on f6 and the pawn on e7 with the fork. And Kortschnoi found a clever move, rook e8, preventing the fork, and he wasn't worried about knight takes f6 because when black takes back with the e-pawn, it opens up a safe haven on e7 for the black king to escape to. And here black's king is safe on e7. So Karpov didn't take. Instead, he reinforced his knight. He played knight f4, and now every white piece is participating in the attack against black's king. Kortschnoi played bishop c6, trying to dislodge that knight on d5, and here Karpov broke through brilliantly and found a way to win the game. And if you would like to find it, pause the tape and have a look. Okay, moving on. So here's the breakthrough. e5. e5, a very forcing move. So black has 2 options. He can either play pawn takes e5 or bishop takes d5. So if pawn takes e5, knight takes f6 check, forcing. Pawn has to take, and now a very nice knight h5, threatening queen g7 checkmate, and pawn takes h5 is met by rook g1 check with mate in 2. Now, you might ask, why did Karpov play e5? Why not just immediately play knight takes f6 check, e takes f6, and knight h5? Well, here, Kortschnoi would have the defensive resource queen g5 check, forcing a trade of queens. Although, at first glance, it looks good for white after knight f6 check, winning the exchange. But after king g7, takes, black actually has more than enough compensation for the exchange, and he has very strong kingside pawns, and black is actually much better in this endgame. So that's why Karpov played e5 first, and Kortschnoi, who understood he was unable to take on e5, tried the only other option, bishop takes d5. But now Karpov became winning after e takes f6, e takes f6, and now not knight h5, because rook e1 check is mate in 2 now for black. Black received some counterplay when that e-file opened up. But rather, now white has a forced win with queen takes h7 check, king f8, queen h8 check, king e7, knight takes d5 with check. Every move is forcing, and after queen takes d5, rook e1 check skewers that rook on e8. And Kortschnoi gave up. So, a very nice game by Karpov. That helps us to understand how black shouldn't play the dragon in this position. So let's go back to the moment where Kortschnoi played that mistake, rook on 4 to c5, and let's look at the correct way to play this position. It's been discovered now that black should play 19 bishop e6, which introduces the bishop into the kingside attack, and the bishop also covers that important square on d5 where white will often put a knight. So after bishop e6, let's say that white plays the forcing move g5, which is very common. Knight h5, and now knight f4. And now I think we're already familiar with the move for black. Rook takes c3. And for example, if rook takes c3, rook takes c3, and pawn takes c3, now after queen takes c3, black's position became very good. He has plenty of compensation for the exchange. And after this move, knight takes h5, there might be several perpetuals here with queen a1 check and queen d4 check, where it's hard for white's king to escape to e2 because of bishop c4, but I don't think that black needs to settle for a perpetual here. He can play simply pawn takes h5, and remember, he's never getting checkmated here as long as his queen controls this diagonal, keeping white's queen out of h8. So here, black can make a draw at his leisure, and there's opportunity to look for ways to play for a win.